Well, I always start with some kind of musical lyric, so I better continue the tradition. I learned about 15 minutes ago that you were going to do a visual montage. So the song of the afternoon is "Every Picture Tells a Story, Don't It?" by Rod Stewart. And but I know that the medium that you're discussing is more words than visual imagery. So I took a verse from that song, and it said, "If they had the words I could tell to you to help you on your way down the road, I won't quote, no, not Dickens, Shelley, or Keats, because it's all been said before. Make the best out of the bad and laugh it all off. You don't have to come here anyway, but you just must remember that every picture tells a story, don't it?" So, welcome everyone. This is how would I say, a theme that's close to my heart. I was once an engineer, a rather brittle sort, at MIT, and I walked into a class where the professor recognized me from the school newspaper as a sailor, because I was on the sailing team at the school. He and I started talking about sailing. I sat in on his lecture. I ended up becoming part of the course and becoming an economist through his mentorship. His name was Charles Kindleberger. He's an economic historian. And in the first 2 or 3 weeks that I met him, he took me to the Boston Symphony, and then he gave me a document, which I think I passed out to all of you, which was he was a professor emeritus at the time, and it was his readings for retired bankers. And there was a whole section on fiction with Zola's Money, and I can't remember which, Balzac, but there were a variety of novels. And here I was, an engineer, working in laboratories and all of that, very quantitative. And I started by reading those novels. And it drew my interest and drew me toward the economic history. And he was working on a book at the time called Manias, Panics, and Crashes, which is probably the best preparatory manual for running something to subsequently be called INET that I could imagine. So at any rate, I think my own sense of how people learn and how they discern truth is very much related to the arts. And my sense is that when we do not have good models, and we do not have good guide or representation as to how to conduct ourselves in the world, art is a way, it beckons us. It's what Lynn called in a meeting the other day, the counter-narrative emerges. And hopefully people are sensitive and learn and reactive in a positive way to the arts, though obviously we've had some difficult times where people react to, how we say, oppressive regimes react by trying to curtail the arts and the humanities. And I will give you just a modest editorial that in the United States right now, I am very concerned about the resources and support for the humanities. I remember, George Lucas headed a commission on the humanities a year or so ago that was quite inspiring. Matter of fact, Richard Freeman, who's a Harvard economist, was on that panel as well. But anyway, I don't want to take any more of your time because there's more artistic things to learn. We have an excellent panel and a discussant, Doug Carmichael, and I'll start by thanking both Doug and Lynn for helping us curate this, which is a new dimension for INET and hopefully something that will continue in the years ahead. But thanks to both of you for being the pioneers. At any rate, so I believe we'll go in alphabetical order today with the presentations. And first, Nicholas Boyle from Cambridge University. And then we'll be followed, okay, it doesn't matter, P or S, you're both in the middle of the alphabet, and then Sarah Thornton.
My topic today is Goethe's Faust and its relevance to the roots of modern subjectivity. By subjectivity, I understand the self as the self experiences it. In other words, what it is, what it means to me to say I. Well, to start with my subject, in both senses, my professional occupation, the starting point from which I've tried to understand modern culture, has long been the literature of Germany. And it's virtually a commonplace that modern German literature is concerned in a peculiarly sustained way with the representation and the questioning of modern subjectivity. But what is the precise nature of this subjectivity, this sense of I? Well, I want to, in these few minutes, to look at the socio-economic roots of that notion. And I think that in the form of society that first arose in Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, and that the subsequent process of economic globalization has spread across the world, the human individual has become defined as the point of intersection of two socio-economic processes, consumption and production. And similarly, the subjectivity, the sense of who they are of those individuals, has taken on two different specific forms. There's a subjectivity of the consumer and a subjectivity of the producer. Just as there is a subject, a self, that has the power to receive and enjoy the world, and a subject, a self, that has the power to shape the world through work. In modern Europe, these two aspects of the subject have been given preeminent expression in Europe's literary and intellectual culture by the two wings of the European middle class that have also formed its economic and its political culture. I mean, on the one hand, the bourgeoisie, in the strict sense of the term, the owners of capital, who have expressed the consuming subject, and on the other hand, the bureaucracy, the officials of the state, who have given expression to the producing subject. And the different fortunes of these two branches of the middle class, the bourgeoisie and officialdom, have been responsible for different cultural outcomes in Western Europe's different nations. In England and France, from the 17th century, there's been a significant property-owning middle class, a bourgeoisie in the full sense of the word, that's been able to find an outlet for its capital and its energies in trade and industry, in emigration and empire, and eventually in political revolution and reform. In Germany, the equivalent class was proportionally much smaller and was shut away in the decayed remains of its late medieval towns, where it could engage in political and economic activity of only local importance. What Germany, however, had in abundance was a class of state officials and of Protestant clergymen, who were state officials by another name. These officials were close to political power and were often its executive arm. But they couldn't exercise that power in their own right, and they could only look on enviously at the achievements of their counterparts in England, Holland, or Switzerland, or after 1789 in France. One of them wrote, I quote, "They do the deeds, and we translate the narratives of them into German." Nonetheless, while the contribution of the French and English bourgeoisie to modern intellectual culture is widely understood, generations of unprecedented mental exertion and indeed personal suffering within the pressure vessel of German officialdom also brought into existence some of our common culture's most characteristic features, which elsewhere took much longer to develop. In the 17th and 18th centuries, these two variants of the middle class created two different enlightenments. Both enlightenments had their ultimate origin in the decay of the feudal order, which set in as the monetarization of social relationships began, and as the high Middle Ages passed the peak from which Dante surveyed a perfectly just universe. Two enlightenments. On the one hand, there was the bourgeois Enlightenment, which criticized the feudal estates, firstly the clergy, then the nobility, for their inability to justify their existence and their privileges by their contribution to the circulation of money and the growth of capital. The liquidation of clerical and aristocratic property during the Reformation and the English and French revolutions was preceded and accompanied by a spate of political and philosophical polemic directed against the property owners. It might be urbane and humorous in the hands of Erasmus or Mandeville, passionate or ideological, when the Diggers or Tom Paine were responsible, or just painstaking and remorseless, as we find it in the writings of Locke and Voltaire. But this essentially empiricist critique, with its appeal to what to a banker or merchant or master craftsman would seem equity, common sense, or observable fact, that essentially empiricist critique culminated in the 18th century in the new science of political economy and in the work of Bentham, in both of which human beings are, as a matter of principle, made as equivalent and uniform as units of the coinage, and neither nobility nor clergy have a great part to play. But at the same time, we find the remnants of the medieval world being criticised from quite a different quarter and from quite a different first premise, the premise of the primacy of collective order. And this monarchical or bureaucratic enlightenment, as we may call it, was principally the work of officials of the crown being the main political beneficiary of the collapse of feudalism, these officials were seeking to eliminate the independence of historic institutions, including such third estate anomalies as free cities and guilds, and seeking to subordinate them to a single administrative will. Sometimes benign in its earlier versions, Thomas More, Boudin, sometimes ruthless, Machiavelli, Hobbes, the attempt to see in society a centralized structure corresponding to or deducible from the structure of the human mind became the systematic project of generations of philosophers in 18th century Germany, from Leibniz and Wolff to Fichte and the Romantics. So I'm saying these are Enlightenment figures, but their enlightenment is not based in an empiricist, but in a rationalist critique. Now, these two different traditions had different consequences in literature. The different ways, we might call them, in which the bourgeois mentality, the middle-class mentality, got written down. Philosophy didn't fare so well in England as in Germany. Indeed, after about 1740, the English largely gave it up and instead founded a new literary genre. For the benefit initially of women and domestic servants, whose reading time was paid for by the productive labours of the wage slaves of the head of the household, busy scribblers invented a new form of prose romance in which the bourgeois order ever more confidently reflected and admired itself. Spreading, like industrialisation, from its English homeland, the novel eventually became the most subtle means of representing extensively in language what it was to be human in the modern or bourgeois period of Europe and the Western world, a period which ended at the latest in 1945. The novel thus provides the fullest and most persuasive images of what a human identity might be that is called only to consumption. Its heroes and heroines make their way through the imagined world only as consumers of its delights and horrors, as if they were supported by some hidden capital. From the great consumers of the Renaissance onwards, from Rabelais and Rojas to Buddenbrooks and Ulysses, the consuming subject is bound up with the development of literary realism, and above all of the novel. In the realist novel, the offer made by the devil in Matthew's Gospel is accepted. That's to say, the world and all the glory of it is incorporated into the subject as an object of enjoyment. But what realism can't derive from this literary pact with the devil is the subjective reality of work, the power of work, of action, not just reception, and not just the work by which in the beginning God made the world and all its glory. The realist novel, famously, fails to represent the truth even of human work. Even for Zola, the world of work can in the end be represented only as the object of a kind of perversely picturesque consumption. It becomes an aesthetic, in some perverse sense, beautiful object. What can't be grasped by the realistic means of the novel is the exertion and self-emptying of the producing subject. Representing that, the task of representing, of grasping, the self-emptying of production, has been reserved for the other wing of the European middle class, the bureaucracy of officials, and their preferred form of literary self-expression, that is, systematic and above all idealist philosophy. Marxist materialism, like the materialism of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, I understand simply as a variant of idealism, of idealist philosophy. Systematic philosophy yields to the devil's temptation in a quite different way. Demonstrating its divine freedom and its divine origin, it casts itself into the air, and through the working of its spirit, moving upon the face of the waters, it creates the world anew. Idealist philosophy never attains the realistic density of the novel in its representation of the world as an enjoyable object, but it tracks in precise detail the labour of the subject in bringing its world into being. And I can tell you that reading Hegel is very hard work. Fichte, Marx and Nietzsche, who, by the way, should all be accounted members of the professorate, that is to say of the bureaucracy rather than of the bourgeoisie, they are the fulfillers of the project begun by Montaigne, Descartes and Leibniz. Their work is a humanistic achievement of German literature and the German language that in every respect bears comparison with the achievement of the European novel. But the German language has something even greater to offer to European and indeed to world literature. Three of the greatest masters of this language, Kant, Hegel and Goethe, succeeded in reconciling the demands of realism with those of idealism, and succeeded in defining a form of subjectivity that is both consumer and producer. With his concept of a critical philosophy whose task is to know the limits of the knowable, Kant achieved the same as Hegel, who elaborated Schelling's concept of the spirit that is at once both subject and object. Both Kant and Hegel succeed, that is, in representing a subject that at once both enjoys and receives the world, and that forms it through work. And I think one could say that Goethe created the canonical literary embodiment of this double subjectivity, the subjectivity of enjoyment and of work, in the figure of his Faust. Faust wants to take up into himself the whole realm of possible human experience. And there, he says in one of the play's most influential lines, in himself he wishes to enjoy it. But he also wishes, he says in equally influential terms, to be active without respite, to leave enjoyment behind him, and, as the angels put it at the end of the play, to exert himself in unending striving. Goethe's Faust wants to consume endlessly, but he wants to produce endlessly too. He is therefore the complete representation of the modern subject, the point of intersection of the two processes that combine in would-be endless global economic growth. It did not escape Goethe that this modern subject emerges from a temptation by the devil. Faust wagers with Mephistopheles that he'll be able to consume whatever Mephistopheles offers him, and yet find satisfaction only in his own desire to leave that behind him and to move on to more. And if he does not, if he does find satisfaction in some limited thing, he says he is willing to die. The tragedy of the play, and it is to the genre of tragedy that Goethe in the subtitle assigns it, is both that Faust remains true to his wager and that the wager proves to be a terrible deception. Well, I can't here obviously consider the detailed historical and cultural implications of Faust's life story, but this much is surely plain. The agreement that the devil shall become his servant, which provides Faust with the means of attaining the peaks of human experience, is also the mechanism which destroys what he attains. Each part of the play presents this tragedy, each time through Faust's encounter with a woman. Faust's agreement with Mephistopheles unites him with Gretchen, Marguerite, as she's known in the English-speaking world, but then brings her to despair and death. And that same agreement resurrects Helen of Troy but then causes her to evaporate as an insubstantial phantom before the onward march of grimmer and more material powers. That cruel irony, which is fundamental to the play's structure, is as close as anything we find in any modern drama to what the ancient tragedians thought of as nemesis. Faust, I'm saying, is a modern man in that he has completely fulfilled both Enlightenment's programme of critique. Against the tempter Mephistopheles, who seeks to insinuate that the good and evil of the old order will never be obsolete, Faust wagers that he can live his life in unwavering fidelity to his belief in his own moral autonomy. This belief in his own absolute freedom liberates Faust for a life of activity and achievement which surpasses anything the old order knew. It also empowers him to do evil of greater depth and extent than anything the old order knew either. The endless activity has no purpose. The endless consumption yields no satisfaction. The endless growth creates only the equal and opposite potential for endless destruction. Faust's life is a quest lived in the belief that it is better to seek than to find, and so even what he finds becomes the occasion for further seeking. His quest, therefore, is both self-fulfilling and self-defeating. As his audience, we can see that he loses as much as he finds. But as his audience, we can also recognise how much of our own fragile condition is reflected in his. Goethe's Faust is not just a morality play for the 18th century. It's a tragedy, perhaps the tragedy, of modernity.
I'd like to say just a couple of words of introduction to Professor Boyle, now that he's finished his paper. He's in the middle of a 3-volume biography of Goethe, each volume running around 900 pages. But it's absolutely magnificent. I read the first volume when it first came out and was really affected by it in my own life. And the second volume, which came out about Thank you. He's written another book called Who Are We Now?, which is about the current situation of humanity. And going further, the most recent, I think, is called How to Survive the Next Crisis. And so I think having him here is really wonderful because he spans between being smart about current affairs and a wonderful scholar of the old world. And I think it's a model for how we all ought to learn how to be thinking. And Rob, you want to introduce Lynn? Rob? There we go. Just to say a word about Lynn, not only is she doing a tremendous amount of writing about economics and interviews with people in the contemporary world, but she's written a book about the Egyptian influence on Western civilization, which is just a marvel for people who are as ignorant about the effect of Egypt on Western civilization as I was when I read it. And I just can't believe how sophisticated a great book it is.
Thank you. Well, I want to start out by something that a very smart man said recently by the name of Thomas Piketty. He said, "It is high time that we put inequality back at the center of economic debate and that we start asking questions that were first raised in the 19th century." So that is what my co-author, Jeffrey Spear, and I have done today, for you today. We're raising a question: what is real wealth? And that question was asked by the Victorian art and social critic John Ruskin. John Ruskin rocketed to fame when he was 24 years old. He wrote the first volume. Is it not on? Is it on now? Okay. He rocketed to fame at the age of 24 he wrote the first volume of his book, Modern Painters, which was a hit. And his father, to commemorate this event, bought him a painting by a painter he deeply admired, Turner. And that painting, I'm going to show you here. When you first look at it, it shows this glorious red and orange sunset over a stormy sea. But if you step a little bit closer and you start looking, there's something going on in the foreground of this painting. You begin to see fragments of human bodies thrashing around in the water, bits of chain between them, and monsters of the deep rising up to devour this human flesh. The lines that I have here above this detail of the painting were written by Turner: "Hope, hope, fallacious hope, where is thy market now?" He was inspired to paint this by a fraud case from the late 18th century. The captain of a ship called the Zong ran into bad weather. He had many sick slaves aboard his ship. He reasoned that the insurance company was not going to pay him anything for slaves that died from sickness. But if he could make a claim for dumping cargo that threatened the survival of his ship, he could collect the insurance money. And he threw 132 human beings overboard to die. That was created a lot of outrage, moral outrage on the part of the public, but actually, and the insurance company actually won the claim against the captain, but there were no felony charges, no felony had been committed. It was cargo after all. And this painting really inspired John Ruskin, and the themes contained in it, the tensions between life and death, human life versus market value, drove him to become a very trenchant critic of Victorian capitalism. He's remembered as an art critic, but he was actually a very vociferous critic of the economics of his time. He stood against the economists who wanted to make economics a separate technical discipline and divorce it from moral philosophy, and thereby he was against Adam Smith on that, Nassau Sr., Ricardo, John Stuart Mill. He was happy to argue with anyone. And he stood with writers like Carlyle, who gave us the term the dismal science for economics, and Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell and Lord Tennyson, who rejected this, what they thought of as a really abominable idea that had arisen among economists, that a human being was an atomistic unit floating around in something that Carlyle called the cash nexus. They thought this was an absolutely horrible idea. Ruskin rallied against what he called the gospel of mammonism, which made the pursuit of self-interest a social good. He thought that was very perverse. And a lot of us who are seeking alternatives to a kind of dehumanized economics are really following Ruskinian lines of thoughts, though we don't know it. And Jeff is now going to tell you a little bit more about his life.
John Ruskin was born Ruskin.
There. Okay, there you go.
Okay. Ruskin was born in 1819 to a middle-class Anglo-Scottish family. His mother, Margaret, was an extreme evangelical, and as soon as John could read, she was putting him orally through the Bible, beginning to end, year after year. So the Bible became a kind of verbal unconscious for him, available to be pulled up and reshaped as his own thought developed, as indeed his thinking about Turner. His father, John James, was a very successful wine merchant, but had ambitions to be a gentleman. And he passed on to Ruskin a love of literature and art. So from very early age, he was familiar with the classics of English literature, with Shakespeare, with contemporaries such as Byron and Scott and Wordsworth. And in his later life, became a lifelong translator of Plato and a student of Dante. And of course, as is mentioned, Carlyle was the immediate influence on his social thinking. So a career that began with his description of the judgment passed on that guilty ship, as she says, its thin masts written in the sky in lines of blood, ended with the storm cloud of the 19th century, Jeremiah against the pollution of the world's air, so that he said the empire on which it was said the sun never set has become one on which it never rises. Ruskin first directly addressed the question of economic injustice in an essay called The Nature of Gothic that was tucked into the middle of his architectural masterpiece, The Stones of Venice. His interest in social justice and fairness grew as he began to lose his evangelical faith, and with it, the notion that there would be a reward in the next life for suffering in this one. In the Nature of Gothic, he contrasts his chosen exemplary workman, a cathedral stone carver, who could express himself, as Ruskin saw him, in his own work as a sculptor while contributing to a uniform whole that was impressive. The modern employee, by contrast, repetitive labor dictated by others has turned him into a tool. So he says of the division of labor that it is not truly labor that is divided, but men, so that all the little intelligence that is left in a man is not enough to make a pin or a nail, but exhausts itself in making the point of a pin or the head of a nail. We manufacture, he says, in these factories everything except men. Ruskin is here pitting Smith, the moral philosopher, against Smith, the economist. It was, after all, Adam Smith himself who argued that the division of labor, while efficient in terms of production, would turn men into dolts, unless, again to quote Smith, the government takes some pains to prevent it.
Ruskin was interested in the question of wealth and defining it, and it's a very tricky question. It was a very tricky question then as it is now. In his day, the mercantilist had said that wealth was the store of a nation's gold and silver. The physiocrats said it was the produce from a nation's farms. Adam Smith said it was farm output plus manufactured goods plus the labor it took to produce these things. And Ruskin said, no. That's all crap. Wealth is life. Very simple. It's not something abstract. It's not something quantitative. It is that which makes human beings better off. He understood that the origin of the term wealth comes from the Old English word weal, meaning the well-being or the health of the mind and the body. And he said, and I quote, "There is no wealth but life. That country is the richest which nourishes the greatest numbers of noble and happy human beings. That man is richest who, having perfected the functions of his own life to the utmost, has also the widest helpful influence, both personal and by means of his possessions, over the lives of others." And for Ruskin, the opposite of this kind of wealth was not poverty, but something he called ilth. Ilth was the stuff that accumulated that did no one's life any good, the things that were to death devote, the things that harmed the individual and society. He's sort of getting into the idea of externalities with that. And he believed that an economy functions best that maximizes wealth and minimizes ilth. There was always a ratio between them, but you wanted more wealth than ilth. And he asked the question, what is done with a nation's riches? Are they contributing to life? If just a few people in the nation have riches, could you really consider that country to be wealthy? How did the rich make their money? Did they make it through deception? Did they make it through fraud? He was very concerned with this idea of markets populated by economic man, and he saw that that was going to be no more than a model in which dishonesty was incentivized. He understood that fraud and market failure that dragged down the innocent were going to be a result of that kind of concept. And the foresight of Ruskin's thinking is really obvious when you think about the financial crisis of 2007. The good news is that Ruskinian thinking is making something of a comeback. You can see in the recommendations by Joseph Stiglitz and others that countries measure prosperity by something other than GDP. That's a very Ruskinian way of looking at things, looking at the social costs of what we now call negative externalities like environmental damage. His concern with how people would be defrauded and taken advantage of in markets is sort of leads to things that George Akerlof has written, his 1970 paper, The Market for Lemons, and his upcoming book, Fishing for Fools, which deal with unequal exchange. So he was very prescient, and he understood that the relations of the actual marketplace are really between human beings and their psychology, between human beings and their values, between human beings and their sense of identity. And he knew that these things are organically and not mechanically related to market transactions.
For Ruskin, the Victorian economics was not a science but a false religion. In 1864, he was asked by some businessmen from Bradford to advise them, since he was an architectural expert, on the design of their new stock exchange. Instead, he denounced them as the votaries of a cult based on materialism that rationalized unjust exploitation of the working classes. He said to them, in the manner, as you can recognize his biblical preacher background, "Your railroad stations, vaster than the Parthenon and innumerable. Your chimneys," that should be Wolverhampton, "your chimneys, how mighty and costly than cathedral spires. Your piers, your warehouses, your exchanges, all of these are built to your great goddess of getting on. Look strictly into the nature of the power of your goddess, and she will find that she is not the goddess of everybody getting on, but only of somebody getting on, and this is a vital, or rather deathful, distinction. Nay, you say, they all had their chance. So is everyone in the lottery. Ah, but there must always be the same number of blanks. But in the lottery, it is not skill and intelligence that take the lead, but blind chance. What? Do you think the old practice that they should take who have the power, and they should keep who can, is less iniquitous when the power has become the power of brains instead of fist? The neoliberal version of this religion of inhumanity was supposed to create jobs as well as wealth. But just as in the first liberal age, there is no plan for dealing with the failure of the labor market to act as predicted beyond calling for more of the same. Our versions of the Bradford Exchange and the vast railway stations, one supposes, are such as the headquarters of Apple or Google or the wonderful Microsoft Village that goes on for seemingly ever in Redmond, Washington. As is for the CEOs and the hedge funders who preach about free markets and entrepreneurship, they lobby Washington to make sure, this was the failure of the labor market, they lobby Washington to make sure that the rules of the game are written in their favor and that investment income will be taxed at a lower rate than toil, assuming that even toil is to be had. Ruskin was not a leveler. He did not believe in equality, but he did believe fervently that every human being deserved a start in life that enabled him and her to find work expressive of their human being. He believed that each generation was given the stewardship of the earth with a final end of restoring Eden, not poisoning the planet. Thank you.
Sarah Thornton. I think I can be heard anyway. Sarah Thornton has written eloquently about the experience of living in the Victorian era. She really gets into the psyche of what it's like to be there, and I'm looking forward to her paper.
In 14 and a half minutes, tell you all about consumption and production in the novel, So picking up a little bit on what Nicholas was telling us, but also about the notion of ilth, that is the way in which the novel perhaps tackles that problem. But what I'm going to do is do something a little bit different from the other speakers, and that is to give a bit of insight into the form of the novel, the way it actually functions as a system, and why it might be a good vehicle for the discussion of economics. And so what I want to argue is that the novel is an anarchic and eclectic object, which in a sense is opposed to the closure inherent in systems. Okay, so the closure is wrestled with, that there's resistance to that idea of a fixed or dismal science. And so the aesthetic form allows a kind of free play, and it allows the redrawing of social maps. And we're going to try and see how. And I wanted to start with this image because it's a very well-known image, and it interests me because it's from popular culture, it's from Punch, and it was an ironic message. So it was making fun of the idea of the scission between the labouring population, who are the producers, and the capital, the consumers above. That is that already it was seen as perhaps not taking into account the much more complex interplay between the two spheres. So we're going to have that as our starting point, and think about the way in which what we see in the image is bodily suffering. Down below we see bodily suffering, up above we see commodities, and those who are consuming what has been presumably produced below. And we can perhaps think about the novel as showing us these two spheres in two ways. One of them is the crowd, the labouring crowd, the producing crowd, the sort of downtrodden working class. And on the other hand, massive descriptions, we all read them when we were at school and at university, massively long descriptions in the Victorian novel of items and objects and the beauties of consumer culture. So if we think that all thought is born of bodily experience, that everything we think comes from some form of reaction to the world, a sensorial reaction to the world, we might think about the way in which we can read in the novel that surface of the body, the way the body picks up and registers the production and the consumption, either which it's benefiting from or which it's suffering from. If we look at, for example, this picture of a labouring world, we can see that we've got a feeling here of the collection of humanity. Okay, a vast and impressive vision of mankind. It was not the vision of Engels, who had a vision much more like the caricature in a sense that we just saw. Engels, who saw the the condition of the working classes in 1844, gave us a feeling of a crowd which was atomized and not working together, not coherent, and that crowd was utterly at odds with the splendour of London as he came into London on his ship. And Engels says, after roaming the streets of the capital a day or two, making headway with difficulty through the human turmoil and the endless lines of vehicles, after visiting the slums of the metropolis, one realises for the first time that these Londoners have been forced to sacrifice the best qualities of their human nature, to bring to pass all the marvels of civilization which crowd their city. So in Capital and Labour, we see this upper world and we see the lower world. And it's also two worlds which Elizabeth Gaskell looks at, but Elizabeth Gaskell tries to give us some of the pathways which lead from one sphere to the other. And she does so in two ways. First of all, we have this mechanistic labouring crowd, atomized, but which is also flowing. It's a dynamic crowd, and it has life within it. She also shows us that the crowd is also deathly, that it has a kind of congealed labour in it, going back taking up words and ideas that come from Marx, that objects that are made, that are produced, are in a sense congealed labor. So they are the way in which the worker leaves his soul or leaves his person, leaves his body in the objects which he produces. Now, the same flow of humanity that we see here, we can see in Poe's The Man of the Crowd. I'm going to give you a few titles that you may know so that you can envision these flowing crowds. In Mary Barton, of course, another Gaskell novel, 1848. In Bleak House in 1853, the opening page of Bleak House shows an atomized and unhappy crowd. Tale of Two Cities. And of course, in Zola, we see the working classes going through La Chapelle, La Goutte d'Or, Barbès-Rochechouart, the northern areas of Paris. And of course, in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the crowds who are making what we term the whited sepulchre of London. Okay, so these crowds then are with us, and these crowds are not one thing. And this is one of the things I want to try and tell you, is that the novel doesn't give us one image. What it does is it gives us a kind of working model, almost like a 3D graphic. It's very kinetic, it's very visual, in which we see the crowds transforming into other things. So what we have here then is a vision of a collected crowd, not yet a revolutionary crowd. This is a crowd which is full of different social classes and thinking its way through the problems of Chartism. But what we can think about perhaps is what Nietzsche teaches us, and it's been said that Nietzsche, is, as a complement to Marx's theory of alienation, discusses how the history of mankind is the history of becoming reactive. Okay, that there's a gradual devenir, and there I'm quoting Deleuze and Guattari in their Capitalism and Schizophrenia, which is a nice tool for thought. I'm not trying to put the 1970s philosophers into the Victorian world too forcefully, but I think we can borrow some of their concepts. So this idea of a devenir, of a change. And what we see here is a crowd which is presumably coherent. It's undergone what Elias Canetti in Crowds and Power calls the discharge. That's when a crowd loses its atomized and separate and monad existence of alienation and becomes galvanized into one idea of collective endeavor, if you like. Now, so these two things can cohabit. And we see in Gaskell, but we also see it in Dickens, that this crowd, which is potentially revolutionary, can also become a more docile crowd. It can become the crowd of consumerism, and I'll just give you this image from the Great Exhibition. This is 2 years after the Chartist image that we've just seen. So the Chartist image was 1848, this is 1851. Here we have a very pastoral, romantic image of the exterior of the Crystal Palace, and the crowds, in a sense, in a kind of idle contemplation, but which will soon become, as we see in the next image, a consuming crowd. So you have there an ongoing shift in the crowd, which is performed, if you like, in the pages of the novel. Now, at the same time, the novel is giving us the commodity, okay, the products of the production of the crowd. And commodities are seen to be both still, so as we said, congealed labor, the kind of death of the worker, but also, as Marx tells us, maverick, moving. As soon as they become embroiled in exchange value, they go into a different sphere. So there's an idea that, in a sense, the commodities are not static. It's not just still life, but there's a story in all those objects. Now, a counter-narrative, Lynn was talking to us about counter-narratives. The counter-narrative is that the objects can reveal their production. Okay, it's what he does, Marx, when he tells us about the world in which the if you like, the imprint of the worker is taken away from the object. We don't know how the object was produced. Marx brings back the production and the labour and the suffering into the commercial object, and in a sense so does the novel, even though it's at the same time a celebration of that consumption, as Nicholas was telling us. So the whole mystery of commodities, all the magic and necromancy that surrounds the products of labour, vanishes, therefore, as soon as we come to other forms of production. As soon as we descend into the sphere of production, we see that the commodity is very different. Now, very briefly, in North and South, we have descriptions of bourgeois interiors with beautiful objects. I'm just going to read you a couple of lines from them. Pretty baskets of work stood about in different places, and books not cared for on account of their binding solely lay on one table, recently put down. Behind the door was another table, decked out for tea, with a white tablecloth on which flourished the coconut cakes, and basket piled with oranges and ruddy American apples heaped on leaves. We have that description. Just giving you a little image here to show what a Victorian bourgeois interior might look like. But to also realise that in the next breath, Gaskell shows us a superimposed vision of what this world means, that the objects there are not simply God-given, but that they are in fact the result of all sorts of exchanges and economic exchanges with the empire, so that Mr. Thornton from the novel, who is the cotton mill owner, says, I would rather be a man toiling, suffering, nay, failing successless here than lead a dull, prosperous life in the old worn grooves of what you call more aristocratic society down in the south, with their slow days of careless ease. One may be clogged with honey and then unable to rise and fly. And Thornton then shows her that the objects in her home are objects which are in fact in competition with each other, that there is actual competition, and there are human lives at stake within the objects shown. For example, he says that the Americans are getting their yarns so into the general market that our only chance is producing them at a lower rate. So he's saying we have to get rid of the workers to allow new goods to come in. And we see immediately that the apples and the beautiful baskets of fruit and the different chinas are in fact vying with each other for space on the market. So there again, we have that collapse in a sense of two worlds. And lastly then, if we think about these, we think about Gaskell and we think about the descriptions of objects in her interiors, there's one moment where she makes the two worlds coincide. She makes consumptions, so in the objects, for example, in the china displayed in the home of Mrs. Thornton, she focuses on that and then describes the revolutionary crowd coming at the house, trying to enter the house, and in a sense reclaiming the objects from which they were alienated. So she shows two worlds colliding, which normally are absolutely separate: the sanctity of the bourgeois home and the trudging worker going to work. And there are superb descriptions of the roar of the crowd and the silence of the cotton mills, that the crowd has created its own rhythm, the crowd has created its own sound, which is no longer the sound of acquiescence and mechanical reproduction. So then the dead or the congealed labour is taken away, and we get really a vision of the new world that could occur if there could be more of a coincidence, but an understanding of the way in which the worker places his or her sweat and blood into the objects which are produced. And I wanted there just to show you an image from A Tale of Two Cities of a rioting crowd. These images were extremely popular in the 19th century, and of course inspired by all the Chartist riots that had gone on in London, so that rioting and the commodity are not necessarily always distinct, that there is this kind of desire in the novel to bring them together, and in a sense to go back to our capital and labour from the beginning. We have this separate sphere, which was mocked at the time, which the novel, in a sense, reworks, discusses and shows us the links between the two worlds, and maybe the novel can give us the new capital and labour of the globalised world, which is perhaps this. These are Bengali workers down below, and above them is the capital of Dubai. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
So I want to say some things about why and I were interested in talking about literature and draw you into a conversation about it. It goes something like this. The world is in a lot of difficulty, and economics has not been smart about how to understand what's happening in the world. If you look at the history of economics for the last couple of hundred years, and I think it's already beginning in the shift from morals to the wealth of nations, there's a stripping away of the human, the social, the political, the interpersonal, in order to move towards a world which is a mechanical model that is self-regulating and does itself. Built on the analogy with the planets created by God, and everything runs in a self-regulated way. So the market could do that if the government would stay out of the way. It's a very conservative move that goes over many, many generations. And I think there's no question but what economics tends to work for the managers of business more than the workers in the business. In order to be able to deal with the world's problems as they're unfolding, we need to understand human beings a lot better in order to do a better kind of economics. It isn't clear that it's possible within economics to do that, but we think it needs to be tried. So that's what the effort here is. If you think of the people that we've been listening to about this afternoon, whether it's Ruskin and his kind of neurotic sensitivity to the difficulties of his time, Faust struggling at a kind of high level with the intersection between a lived life and philosophical categories, we're seeing the world revealed through the life of an individual pushed through the circumstances of having to actually live. We don't do that in economics very much. For example, it's often said that we live in a time when world incomes are basically going up. The GDP is going up for 2/3 of the world. It's not true. If you take places that I know about, you can say, okay, the average income is going up, but the average needs to be disaggregated into the 10% that are doing better and the 90% that are doing worse. And we don't have the imagination to catch ourselves in our own logic as we go through these things. If we're going to deal with climate change, with the imminent wars that we're facing, the problem of massive unemployment through robots. I live in Silicon Valley, and I think there's a Stanford student trying to write an algorithm for every job in the world to replace it. It's difficult, and we need an economics that can help. If the task for the future is to integrate human beings into nature and the earth in a more progressive and aesthetic and heartfelt way, we just need the help of an economics which understands those issues and doesn't push them aside. And it's deep in economics. I want to just, for the fun of it, we heard this, you all know the phrase about economics being a dismal science, and we all think we know what Carlyle meant by it. Actually, what Carlyle said was the following. He said, people think that economics is a dismal science. And indeed, if it were, this is the way, if it were about merely the schedules of demand and supply, it would be a dismal science. But in fact, we have to deal with issues like the plantation owners in the Caribbean who have to find ways to get the blacks to work on their plantation the way God designed them to be. That's a very different sense. We live in a world that's stripped down to the myths that are convenient to us. We've got to do better. And that the world of novels is one of the most intense worlds of exploring what lives are really like, and the way they have been lived, the way they are, it raises all these fascinating questions like, is a life in a novel an empirical event? Going back in the history of literature, in England in the, say, about the 1620s, 1630s, there were a lot of ships sailing out of the London harbor towards the rest of the world, and there were broadsides that were printed out that would list the ships and what they were carrying. Within 10 years, those columns of numbers had written beside them a story about what was happening in London and what those ships were about. The first novelists came out of that world of writing those stories that went on economic broadsides. And the two worlds between writing about economics and writing about novels was not yet separate. You have a scene, for example, in Balzac, where in Lost Illusions. Lost Illusions, of course, is all about a young person trying to live in the publishing world of Paris. And it says something like, yes, there's capital, but there's also her sister, credit. Notice turning it into a character. And if you need her, she's not around. But if you don't need her, she's pestering you to make you a loan. There's that kind of language going on all the time. Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, happened to write about 50 other books, most of which were statistical analysis of the rural poor in England in his time. And for him, the task was explaining to the reader how the economy worked. It was a major part of the literature. For example, it was a time when banknotes printed by the Central Bank of England didn't yet exist, so you had paper written by lots of little banks and questions of trust and character. And people who were writing early novels were looking at what they were doing as an education of the reader about how to discern the character of people dealing with legal and financial documents. A simple one, for example, the way we think of a check. There was a struggle for 50 years on how to get the form of what a check was, because the check was seen first as a story. I give so-and-so this amount in exchange for that on this day, and here's my signature. So the idea that the signature's on the bottom right-hand corner, there was a struggle about how to get that so it was typical. So the idea that literature and writing about economics, I mean, even today, the people who write for the Wall Street Journal and people like Lynn are writing really good stories to help us understand what's going on in the world. And the distinction is not that great. Economics has pushed at the formal level for a system that is rather rigid. I want to read you a quote from Ricardo. Political economy considers mankind as occupied solely in acquiring and constantly consuming wealth, and aims at showing what is the course of action into which mankind, living in a state of society, would be impelled if the motive was absolutely ruling their actions. Not that any political economist was ever so absurd as to suppose that mankind are really thus constituted, but because this is the mode in which the science must necessarily proceed, in order to judge how he will act under varying desires and diversions which are currently operating, we must know how he would act under the exclusive influence of each one in particular. No organic analysis, ruled out. Compare it to, in the literary world, Auerbach wrote a book called Mimesis, which is a great study of how reality is represented in literature. And he says, writing about the same time, when Stendhal and Balzac took random individuals from daily life in their dependence upon current historical circumstances and made them the subjects of serious, problematic, and even tragic representations, he opened the way for modern realism, which has developed increasingly rich forms in keeping with the constantly changing and expanding reality of modern life. Literature has done that better than economics. I just finished a novel called A Glass Palace by a guy named Ghosh, which is a study of four generations in Burma. And I know so much more about Burma by reading that than every article about Burma that I've read in the last 2 years in the standard New York Times, Financial Times press. It's really an incredible education and a world that we need to find how to integrate into our economic thinking and get past the mechanical formal models that work for established wealth and not for the good of the planet. So with that too long a speech, I'd like to open it up to discussions from the floor and start with the panel. If any of you have any questions with each other.
Sorry. I was interested about the idea of what you said, Nicholas, about the novel not being able to discuss the self-emptying of production. That interested me very much. And the self-emptying made me the notion of self-emptying made me think of Adam Smith's idea of leaving part of yourself, part of your energy as a worker in objects. But I think I think you're using it in a very different way. But
I think the problem is that novels are themselves a form of enjoyment, so that they necessarily represent whatever they represent as consumed. So even if they're showing us a revolutionary crowd breaking into a bourgeois home, we're still enjoying it, just as if we were in the cinema, where we're not up there on the screen waving our laser guns or whatever it is. We're actually sitting back and eating popcorn. That's the fundamental problem with any literary representation of any activity.
yeah, sorry. And I was also thinking that does critique necessarily mean lack of enjoyment? Because I think one can enjoy and be entertained, but at the same time receive a pedagogic and critique message. I don't think that the two are necessarily exclusive.
No, I think that the very existence of the genre of satire shows us that is perfectly possible. But even satire is not a representation of daily life in the sense of daily work. And Zola is wonderful at showing us what a steam engine looks like, or even possibly what it sounds like, but he can never tell us what it feels like to drive it.
Rob, you want?
No, I want to find out what questions they have. They've been patiently listening. Anybody all the way down? Okay, why don't we do 3 or 4 questions? Start with Jamie, then the gentleman next to him, and then all the way down I see.
Very brief observation to which you may want to react, and then 2 very quick questions for Sarah Thornton. The observation is about the first 2 papers, which seems to me to be an almost a mirror relationship to each other, in that Nicholas Boyle's presentation shows us how the emergence of the modern from the medieval, the Enlightenment is an essentially precursor of the modern economics, and you could even say the ancestor of the neoliberals in their reduction of the individual to a producing and consuming unit, and Faust as the precursor of the protagonist of the Rolling Stones, can't get no satisfaction. Whereas for Ruskin is rejecting and creating what we would call the modern progressive tradition in a rejection precisely of that formalism, and therefore it would suggest that modern progressivism has its roots in the medieval, and I just wonder if that is a correct view. My questions for Sarah is, the 2 questions are for Sarah Thornton. One is, what, just from the visuals from the illustrations in your talk, what is a philosophical instrument? one of the objects being sold in the exposition, and you say, one of the signs said philosophical instruments, and I wondered if you could tell us what those were. And the second question is, what is the significance of the fact that the Bengali workers in Dubai that you are playing that quintessentially, I thought, aristocratic game, cricket?
Connell Smith, OECD. So Ruskin prefigures quite a lot. You've got the externalities, ILF there. You've got, he prefigures the well-being agenda with his focus on wealth. Later on in Force Clavigera, he talks about the depletion of non-renewable resources. He also does quite well on the things that are generally considered wrong with classical economics, so productive, unproductive labour, wages fund theorem, labour theory of value. He was in his time spectacularly influential at a policy level. I think there's a survey of Labour members of Parliament which shows him as more popular than the Bible, which was number 2. Nothing in economics for 100 years, basically, after that. So my assertion, given or the thing I'll throw out, given the topic of this panel, is that the literary format of what he said was a problem, right? It was a loss to economics that we didn't think about what we were trying to maximise, that we swept externalities under the table. And part of the reason Ruskin failed to communicate that is that he talked like an evangelical preacher. Reactions?
Thank you very much for this talk. It seems to me that one point that has been repeatedly made here yesterday and today is that the notion of subjectivity that seems to be prevalent in much of economic orthodoxy, or this idea of a homo economicus, this kind of modern conception, needs to be enriched, supplemented, improved. And so the panel has, I think, sketched out some ways in which direction one could go, mostly drawing on, I would say, 19th century romantic, more or less, notions of subjectivity. And another direction that has been proposed comes perhaps under the name of behavioral economics, something that draws a lot on, psychology, empirical sciences, neuroscience, very much evolutionary theory, etc. Now, I'm wondering if the panel could clarify a bit their own positive propositions for a new ontology, for a new theory of subjectivity, let's say, with respect to and in comparison with these sort of empirical scientific approaches that mostly draw on, evolutionary theory and neuroscience and all that, which to me it seems often, oscillate between partly, very much ontologically in the Enlightenment, modern science frameworks that generated in one way or another capitalism and economics as we know it, and sometimes, switching to very, very postmodern kind of subjectivity where we are flexible, malleable, plastic, engineerable almost. Thank you very much.
I'm going to do the unpopular thing. I am going to take the side of Senior and the Whiggeries and all, well, not so much take the side, but remind that there's a slight dark underside, sinister side to Ruskin and Carlyle and these romanticisms of pastoral pasts, that these are hierarchical societies with no mobility, and that there's a certain amount of opposition from these. Some of this literature is also is about the I don't want to say upturning, but certainly upsetting of the pre-capitalist hierarchical societies that was in this medieval imagination that they might have had, or in Carlyle's case, even the imagination of a slave plantation as some sort of ideal.
I really don't know what a philosophical instrument is, but I shall go away and look it up immediately.
I think I can answer the question. It simply means what we nowadays call scientific.
Yes, well, I think
The Cambridge Philosophical Society is the natural science society. Natural philosophy was natural science until the late 19th century.
there's an absolute roof and an inability to traverse. And I would say also that, in a sense, to respond a little bit to the question about subjectivity, that it's part of this kind of bricolage. That is a kind of, to create, the subjectivities are created from all sorts of influences, and that there is a subjectivity below and above, which I think is denied in a sense in political economy in the 19th century in the same way. So, but yes, the cricket playing is extraordinary, and that was why I chose that picture, because of its, because it does mess up the neat division between the two worlds.
But it also has an on that colonial aspect.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Colonial and maybe not even post-colonial, yes.
I'll deal with the Ruskin questions, I guess. Though I might say that perhaps cricket got to be so unpopular in India because it fits the Indian concept of time much better than than our other Western sports. One reason Ruskin's interesting in this regard is that if we can use the term neutrally, he's a reactionary. He's not a progressive, and yet his words were quoted by people from the Labour Party. And so it was a very selective reading. One reason, again, I would think he's interesting to bring up is that he gets away from the Marx versus capitalism dichotomy because he comes from a whole other place. Now, that's a reactionary place, but it was an idea about the Middle Ages that had everybody theoretically, not real history, connected to everybody else. And it was opposed to the atomization of working people and to the atomization of society. So, and of course, Ruskin's own personal life was extremely upset, to put it mildly. And so some of the actual proposals he made on the basis of his principles, I've been very careful to abstract a few principles and not suggest that everybody, for instance, should get married on one day of the year like they used to do in Venice. Ruskin has a lot of that kind of particularity that is of no particular use to us. The main reason, again, I think that Ruskin is significant to think about is because he begins with first things, with premises. And I think one of the problems we face in dealing with a deductive science is always with where do we start? Because if we start from the wrong place and believe in the system, we throw up our hands and say, this is what happens with the system. And so one reason I wanted to bring up Ruskin is if you start with his idea, and let's just say that the idea that there is no wealth but life is what you might call a mission plan for society, okay? And it's not, as it were, an economic proposal as such. But if that's our mission plan, then we look at society and the results of the sciences that are supposed to tell us how things work, perhaps in a different way. And that's why I think that his thinking is significant. I don't know if I've covered all of this. I'll stop there.
Something.
Oh, by all means.
Because I'm obviously interested in the idea of a new ontology of subjectivity. I certainly don't think that neuroscience is the place to look for it. We might be a good deal more old-fashioned and pay a bit more attention to the first part of the phrase political economy. What is missing from so much of the discussion, well, even that we've had this afternoon, exemplified by that wonderful quote from Ricardo, is a recognition that economics and politics cannot be separated. And if you try to separate them, you end up with that sort of atomized crowd, as that we heard about this afternoon, as the image of collective human interaction. It isn't, of course. The interaction of millions of people is only in certain very special circumstances best represented by an amorphous crowd. Most of the time it's represented by a structured interaction of people who don't know each other at all, who are put in connection with each other not only by economics, but by the political structure of which they are a part. That's to say, the structure in the end of force. And we haven't talked at all about the role of force in the creation of a collective organisation, and therefore also of the subjectivity of the members of that organisation. And that's where German philosophy comes in, because that is exactly what idealist philosophy, and especially in its supreme achievement, in Hegel, did. Hegel's political philosophy is not just a philosophy of the state, it's a philosophy of the interaction between the state and the system of needs and their satisfaction, as he calls it, that's to say, the economy. That's what we need, and that is in fact what we were given 200 years ago. So I would say all our economic journalists should be reading their Hegel, not their Ruskin.
It's not fun to read Hegel.
I want to come to the question, the question on the, what is the view of subjectivity that we are trying to present? And I think it's really pretty simple. It's not any new collection of categories. It starts with the idea that any scientific statement whatsoever comes along with a narrative. Every scientific paper has a narrative that goes with it. What's happened is those narratives have become so thin, they aren't really helpful in understanding what's in the rest of the work. And I think that a return to a discipline of narratives, learning how to write good narratives that describe the problems that are actually worth working on, would be something that we would be advocating. I think that in the world the way it is right now, one of the places to look for those narratives is coming from anthropology. The work in anthropology and also in archaeology right now, if we think of David Graeber's book, Death the First 5,000 Years, which opened up this quite a bit, there is a tremendous amount there. The idea, for example, that Adam Smith was wrong about bartering, early people did not do that because it requires already that they be individuals, and that didn't exist yet. It was a social construction. So you had the thing where the hunt and the harvest were brought into the community and stored in a central way and distributed there based on need is a totally different kind of model. And the fact that we have that model in anthropology being worked out now quite well gives some hope about being able to rethink the system that we're in. And that's what we need. We need a lot of imagination, we need a lot of efforts, we need a lot of experimentation, and we need a kind of economics that can support a world of experimentation. The economics we have is not terrific at that. I want to say a word about the neurology stuff. I'm a physicist by background. And I shifted over and became a psychoanalyst, which sounds like a big deal, but the two have some deep similarities. What strikes me is that if you look at the things that go together, evolutionary theory, neurology, behavioral, complexity theory, I think we have a danger of the emergence of a new orthodoxy with all those, which is maintaining the capacity to keep quantity and calculation in the forefront and avoid meaning. The avoidance of meaning in economics is not innocent. It's very easy with the early writers to find them talking about why they are serving the rich and not the poor. if you think of things like the macro-micro distinction, it's motivated. Gee, if you have micro and you look for where class is there, you can't find it. You shift over and look at macro, where's the class? It's not there, so let's not talk about it. It's a deeply motivated attempt to treat the political system as beyond criticism. The economic system is beyond criticism because it's mechanical, it's a law, and we have a science to deal with it, as though it's not a man-made thing. We all live with these words. You know, we know what law means in the courts, and we know what law means in science. And we use it in economics in ways that mix that up in a self-serving way. So.
We're going to have very quick final comments because we're running late.
Okay.
Start just straight on down. Start with Sarah.
Okay, just very quickly, if I could do that. Just to say that, yes, I think we do need to go back to Hegel. I think we do need the idea of a Geist, but we can't just go back to Hegel. I would say that we could go back to Kojève's reading of Hegel. And I think we also need psychoanalysis. I think your question about subjectivity, that is such an excellent question, because all the way through this conference I've been thinking, okay, so what is it we're going to actually do? How are we going to make this new economic thinking? How are we going to do what we were asked to do, and that is come up with a theorem? And it's to do with subjectivity. And I think that there is a subjectivity to be looked at in psychoanalysis, not only psychoanalysis, but it has to be the idea of how we make a psyche, and that a psyche is linked to a subjectivity, and that it is an ongoing and very complex creation, and not just behavioral science, and not just a fixed subject. Sorry.
Just very quickly, because this hasn't really come up, one of the things that I hoped as an outsider to be doing here is to suggest that the answers to how we make public policy are not exclusively the matter of economics, and yet economists have become the new gurus. Every time there's a social question on television, an economist is pulled out to explain it. So one of the things I'm hoping that by bringing literature, by bringing anthropology, bringing other disciplines in, that there are two things as an outsider I hope that this organization would do. One is to push at, insofar as it has access to the people who form opinion, because we have to live in the media world that we have. You can't remake it no matter what happens with economics. And the second is to try and broaden this base so that economists are in a conversation with other people, and when the TV has its list of people that it wants to talk to, they might bring a historian in along with the economist. Or the university world is full of people who think about some of these things from other angles, and rarely accept that something in their own specialty happens to make the news, get part of the conversation. So a kind of disestablishment of economics as the end-all and be-all of the discussion of any public policy would be, I think, a great favor to economics, actually.
I spoke recently at Lehigh University to a group of very anxious graduate students in literature, and they were terrified of not being able to find a tenure-track job at a university. And they kept saying, what will we do if we don't get a tenure-track job? What is there for us to do in the world? And I felt that that was the saddest question, because we have, as Jeff just said, ceded the public sphere to one kind of expert, an economist, and there should be others. It's not to say the economists don't have something important to say, but there are other voices. And so I'm really excited by this effort to start building those bridges, for the sake of everyone, but to really bring other voices into the public sphere, and not treat a PhD in philosophy or a PhD in literature as some kind of specialized being that is going to be stuck in an ivory tower, and that's the last you're going to hear from them. So I'm excited that this may be part of that effort. And I, of course, I'm not an academic, so I'm proof that it can actually happen.
Well, I've been waving a flag for German philosophy. I think what I'd like to say in conclusion is that philosophy and literature should not be thought of, as in the Anglo-Saxon world they generally are, as worlds apart. Specifically in the German world, they are very much closer together. And indeed, they were very close indeed at the end of the 18th century in the age of Goethe and Hegel. And it was that fact which inspired Carlyle precisely in the 1820s to look to Germany for the way out of his own spiritual crisis. So Carlyle has been invoked as the sort of original fountain of the of Victorian social thinking. We must remember that behind Carlyle lie German idealism, and indeed somebody we haven't mentioned, Schiller, whose letters on the aesthetic education of man contain one of the first and most eloquent critiques of the division of labour. Yes, I think literature certainly has something a part to play in new economic thinking, but it should do so in partnership with philosophy.
Okay, well, we better tie things up here. The only thing that caused me a little discomfort was the idea that economists would think it was good for them. That society probably would think it was good for them. I had a bit of a fantasy as I was listening to you all, and it comes back through, you know, they always said Lenin was a real critic of capitalism, but I'm talking about John Lennon. And he came up with a song, and it goes like this. I'm looking through you. Where did you go? I thought I knew you. What did I know? You don't look different, but you have changed. I'm looking through you. You're not the same. Perhaps panels like this and perhaps further efforts on the literary front will inspire economists to come out of their hard shell. And they might embrace someone like, well, in reference to Doug's discussion of Balzac, someone like Joni Mitchell, where she says, I've looked at life from both sides now, from win and lose and still somehow. It's life's illusions I recall. I really don't know life at all. Thank you all.